The story of the Wilde trials, and that's Wilde trials as in plural, is one that's intimately bound up with the history of LGBT representation in Western culture. It's a phenomenon that has a currency beyond simply just the English-speaking world, and in a sense it has come to define the concept of gay representation. In Foucault's History of Sexuality, there is the infamous line, "There is no homosexuality before 1895, which indicates the year of Oscar Wilde's trials. This is, of course, not true. What Foucault really meant was that even though the sexual practice of homosexuality had existed since time immemorial, there really was no idea of the male homosexual as an identity until Oscar Wilde came along and codified it to a certain degree. The word homosexual itself does not enter English-speaking discourse until the early 1890s. Laws prohibiting buggery and sodomy had been on the books of English common law since at least the late medieval period. But even at that, given that it was the Victorian era, Wilde was not initially charged with any of these things, but rather acts of gross indecency. This charge was defined under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which itself was derived from the Offenses Against Persons Act of 1860. This is all important because one of the things that comes through in the trial, in which a lot has been written about, is the argument over words and what they mean. Even though this took place during the Victorian period, where such things were not only not discussed in polite company, but were not even talked about with any degree of detail in popular writing or newspapers, the Wilde trials were marked by confusion at practically every level as to exactly what Wilde was being prosecuted for and also why. To begin the story, we have to start with Alfred Bosie Douglas, the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. Bosie was Wilde's major boyfriend throughout the 1890s, and it should be said also that he and Wilde had sexual relations with other people. By 1895, they had long since ceased to sleep with each other, yet remained intimate and nearly inseparable. Throughout 1894, the Marquis of Queensberry had been disturbed by his son's relationship with Wilde, and at one point had prevailed upon Wilde, even going to his home around tea time, demanding that he explain his relationship with Bosie. Wilde denied every rumor that the Marquis had heard, and at least for that hour, Wilde had convinced him there was nothing improper going on. In the weeks and months after that, the Marquis began to get angrier and angrier about Wilde's unchecked behavior, and believed that he should be punished for it. The Importance of Being Earnest, Wilde's most well-known play, premiered on Valentine's Day 1895. Just a few days after that, the Marquis of Queensberry went to Wilde's club, the Albemarle, looking for Wilde. Failing to find him there, he instead wrote on his calling card, the one that's pictured here, for Oscar Wilde posing sodomite. And yes, there's that extra M placed in there. Upon hearing of this, Bosie's reaction was to goad Wilde into filing a libel case against his father, given that the message had been written on the card rather than spoken. Initially, Wilde was reluctant to do this, but then, figuring that his honor and pride were at stake, he went ahead and did it anyway. The result spelled doom for Oscar Wilde. Part of the problem with filing a libel suit against someone is that going to sue someone for libel, the thing that they are saying about you had better not be true. Wilde's case, of course, it was. One of the legal protocols of a libel trial in the UK is the plea for justice, which prefaces any trial where the defendant, in this case, the person accused of libel, provides evidence that their claim, whatever it is true. For the Marquis of Queensberry's legal team, they provided a list of 13 young men, in addition to textual material from The Picture of Dorian Gray and other things, in order to prove their case. This list is comprised of men who were paid by Wilde, with the exception of Edward Shelley. These payments were coordinated by Alfred Taylor, whom we're going to get to in a moment. Some of his friends had encouraged him before the libel trial not to press his case against the Marquess of Queensberry and just to let it go. Wilde instead was listening to Bosie and pressed on. However, when the trial started, as soon as the plea for justice was entered, it was clear to everybody around Wilde that this was a very grave mistake. And as Wilde began to be cross-examined by Ned Carson, who was an old schoolmate from Trinity University, Dublin, it became clear that Wilde would eventually have to abandon his lawsuit, which he did after that day of testimony. Once Wilde withdrew his suit, it became clear that he was about to be prosecuted for gross indecency, given the evidence that was already in the court record and provided by the Marquess of Queensberry. Even though the Marquess of Queensberry's defense counsel and the Crown gave Wilde every opportunity to simply leave the country and go to France by prolonging the number of defense witnesses where Wilde wouldn't have to be involved, Wilde nevertheless stayed in London and was arrested at one of his favorite places, the Cadogan Hotel in Chelsea, and accused with grossly indecent acts. After Wilde's arrest, there were two separate trials. The first one yielded the most iconic moment of the entire episode. During the course of the initial cross-examination, Counselor C.F. Gill asked Wilde about the content of Bosie's poems, one of which was published in the Chameleon, an Oxford student publication. Specifically, Gill wanted Wilde's reaction to the conclusion of the poem Two Loves, which reads as follows. I fell a-weeping, and I cried, Sweet youth, tell me why, sad and sighing, thou dost rove these pleasant realms. I pray thee speak me sooth, what is thy name? He said, My name is Love. Then straight the first did turn himself to me, and cried, He lieth, for his name is Shame, but I am Love, and was wont to be alone in this fair garden, till he came unasked by night. I am true love, I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame. Then sighing, said the other, Have thy will, I am the love that dare not speak its name. When Wilde was asked what the love that dare not speak its name was, Wilde gave this famous answer. The love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on account of it I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection, there is nothing unnatural about it, it is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder man has intellect, and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so the world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it. It is doubtful that Wilde intended this defense to vindicate him. Nevertheless, it has become the emblematic moment of the trial. Eventually, the first trial ended in a hung jury with a verdict of 10-2 to convict. The second trial moved forward with a focus on Alfred Taylor, who had been the procurer of the young men who were named in the plea for justice of the libel trial. Taylor had already been convicted of the same crime with both of the Parker brothers, one of whom was named in the plea for justice. The charge was also reduced from sodomy to indecency, given that the latter was a lot easier to prove. The jury convicted Wilde and Taylor on all counts except for those that related to Edward Shelley, who, in addition to Douglas, was not paid for sex. Justice Wills, in rendering the verdict, prefaced it with a scathing peroration. Oscar Wilde and Alfred Taylor, the crime of which you have been convicted is so bad that one has to put stern restraint upon oneself to prevent oneself from describing, in language which I would rather not use, the sentiments which must rise in the breast of every man of honor who has heard the details of these two horrible trials. That the jury has arrived at a correct verdict in this case, I cannot persuade myself to entertain a shadow of a doubt, and I hope, at all events, those who sometimes imagine that a judge is half-hearted in the cause of decency and morality because he takes care no prejudice shall enter into the case, may see that it is consistent at least with the utmost sense of indignation at the horrible charges brought home to both of you. It is no use for me to address you. People who can do these things must be dead to all sense of shame, and one cannot hope to produce any effect upon them. It is the worst case I have ever tried. That you, Taylor, kept a kind of male brothel it is impossible to doubt, and that you, Wilde, have been at the center of a circle of extensive corruption of the most hideous kind among young men, it is equally impossible to doubt. I shall, under the circumstances, be expected to pass the severest sentence that the law allows. In my judgment, it is totally inadequate for a case such as this. The sentence of the court is that each of you be imprisoned and kept to hard labor for 2 years. To Wilde's response, "And may I say nothing, my lord?" just as Wills waved for the bailiffs to take Wilde away. Wilde would indeed spend the next 2 years at Reading Gaol, writing such works as The Ballad of Reading Gaol and also De Profundis, both of which reflected on his profound sadness and regret about his experience. After leaving Reading Gaol, Wilde would immigrate to France, where he would die a few years later, his health destroyed by his incarceration. Ever since the trials of Oscar Wilde, there has been endless debate as to exactly what this all meant. In the libel trial brought by Oscar Wilde, the defense team of the Marquis of Queensberry cited the picture of Dorian Gray as evidence of Wilde's gross indecency. When cross-examined about the book specifically, Wilde denied anything about it, and invoked the language of the preface to the same book to describe not only that book, but also other works, such as The Priest and the Acolyte, which was published in the Chameleon along with the 2 poems by Douglas. When pressed about the story The Priest and the Acolyte by John Francis Bloxham, Wilde did not attest to the immorality of the content of it, which depicts a pedophilic relationship between the characters described in the title, but rather said, I didn't like it because it was badly written. This surely invokes the line in the preface to Dorian Gray. There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. This didn't stop contemporary critics from claiming to find some kind of moral meaning in Picture of Dorian Gray. To be utterly consistent about it, Wilde dismissed George Bernard Shaw, who defended the book on moral grounds and who said it was a very moral one in any event. Similarly, there's been a great deal of speculation as to who Wilde is in Picture of Dorian Gray. And quite famously, he said around the time of the publication of the novel, "Basil Hallward is what I think I am, Lord Henry what the world thinks of me, Dorian what I would like to be, in other ages perhaps."